One of the best things to do to understand the beauty of Spring Boot is to understand how things were done before Spring Boot. In this step, we will look at one of the projects which we developed in our Spring MVC course. Before we start with any project, we need to decide what frameworks and dependencies to use. This was a web project, so we would want to use Spring MVC and things like that. So we needed to make decisions on what frameworks and what versions of them to use. We needed to decide I would want to use Spring Web MVC. I would add Spring Security Web, Spring Security Config. I would want to use Jackson Data Bind because I want to do some binding and validation. I would want to use JSTL, and I would want to use Hibernate validator. And also for logging, I would want to add in log4j. We had to decide what dependencies to add into our projects. Not only that, we needed to decide the versions of them as well. Sometimes this 5.0.2.final version might not be compatible with some other version of Spring MVC. So you needed to decide what are the compatible versions and start using them. Choosing the frameworks to use and which versions to use is a major decision that we needed to make when we were not using Spring Boot. We needed to implement default exception handling. You can see that here we are just implementing simple default exception handling. And we needed to create a complete Spring configuration file. We needed to define the component scan. Then we would need to configure a view resolver to redirect the views to a JSP. To implement internationalization, we needed to implement a message source and also a locale resolver. And in addition to that, we needed to configure our web.xml as well. We needed to configure the dispatcher servlet in web.xml so that it can handle all the requests and act as a front controller. We needed to configure the context configuration location in here, and we also needed to configure Spring Security. We needed to configure a filter for it and make sure that it intercepts all the requests. There's a lot of work that you would need to do to get a simple web application up and running. We configured dependencies, dependency versions, Spring configuration, configuration for internationalization, logging, and a lot of other stuff. All this stuff which we looked at in this specific step is the kind of stuff which you don't need to do with Spring Boot. Spring Boot would automatically provide all that stuff for you so that you can really concentrate on developing your business logic. All the infrastructure would come free for you. The idea behind this step was to give you an idea of the world before Spring Boot. If we directly jump into Spring Boot, you might not really appreciate the value that Spring Boot provides. All the stuff which we looked at in this specific example would be replaced by a simple startup project called Spring Boot Starter Web in combination with Spring Boot Starter Security. Just the combination of these two starters would eliminate the need for a lot of configuration that we looked at in this specific step. We will look at those starters and a lot more about Spring Boot in the subsequent steps. Until then, bye bye.